Welcome both. We'll start with our next session. To just quickly give a quick introduction about what we will be talking about. The concept of the commons as a space of collectivity and community can create new ways of learning and sharing of experience. The commons can also emerge out of states of emergency when the governing infrastructure is no longer viable. So what does it look like when the space of the commons flourishes at times of chaos and consequently subverts accelerated industry? And how have design and curatorial practices used the commons to establish new ways of co-learning and co-working in rapidly changing times? Yesterday, we talked about numerous curatorial research projects, as well as heard from art workers working within established systems of art. But what about when there is a lack of infrastructure, funding, patronage, when there is social and political chaos? How do we organize and make space for thinking and learning together and from one another? When we don't have the comfort, access, and privilege of the built infrastructure and the institution to provide us with the content we should be learning. And then alternatively, there's taking these experiences, whether it is from having a lived experience in the space of the refugee camp or thinking materially about the context and current world we live in with life-threatening issues of climate change and a lack of knowledge about history, what has come before us and how it impacts our life today, for example. Essentially bringing this experience into the space of the university or the biennale. In the case of my guests here, and preserving not just the idea of the commons, but the feeling and the spirit of the common as well, as a way that informs one's curatorial, writing practice, and teaching and design practice. Campus and Camps, founded by Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti, who unfortunately could not join us in Dubai this time around, have a compelling goal. It's one of many, but this in particular is the grounding of learning processes that is rooted in experience. I quote from the website, "To weave together elements for a new kind of project able to transmit independent, personal, and fertile approaches to, in their particular project, the Palestinian refugee camps." And the communities in those camps. Through this work, they created a collective dictionary with contributions from members of the community, again, rooted in experience. I introduced one of our cushions earlier, bell hooks, and it's quite convenient to have her here. I just wanted to expand a little bit more on this person. She believes that educating is the practice of freedom, and Hooks describes it as a way of teaching in which anyone can learn. She investigates the classroom as a source of constraint, but also a potential source of liberation. She advocates that universities should encourage students and teachers to transgress and seek ways to use collaboration to make learning more relaxing and enjoyable and exciting. In her books, she offers advice about how to continue to make the classroom a place that is life-sustaining and mind-expanding, a place of liberating mutuality where teacher and student together work in partnership. So Hooks, writes that education as a practice of freedom enables us to confront feelings of loss and restore our sense of connections, and consequently teaches us how to create community. So I feel this spirit here today through the work of my colleagues Amir and Nataša, whose curatorial and design work extends into education, which to Bell is a vocation rooted in hopefulness. Some of the terms that arise out of this kind of work and thinking: responsibility for the project, the work, the space, and the community at large; sustainability when creating new projects, new works. How does sustainability actually manifest? Ownership. How does responsibility, creating a common place for the community, whether it's a classroom or a biennale, inspire a sense of ownership and agency? And we'll discuss this in concrete ways. Emancipatory education, which we can recognize in the work of Campus and Camps, for example, and many collectives, such as our friends Nomedan and Gediminas, and their swamp school. How do our histories, which are also personal experiences guiding our work and our thinking, and finally creating a common place for the community in one's curatorial design and artistic practice? So let's think about those following terms and what they also practically mean. Think about downsizing, degrowth, changing the way we work and learn, the context and where we're speaking from, and reconstruction, what can we learn from it? Just some terms that inspired me from our conversation this morning over breakfast. So we'll start first with Amir Berbić, who's a professor and chair of graphic design at the University of Illinois in Chicago. At Chicago's School of Design. His work is featured in Design Issues, Visual Communication Journal, Print, Graphies, Society of Typographic Arts, World Design Congress, and in the permanent collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome, Amir.
Thank you. So I, as a teacher of design, a studio-based practice, actually I never teach from a podium, so I figured there's one here, so I'll make use of it. I also have pages of notes, so I thought this would be a more organized, so it gives me a little bit of shelter. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Fawz. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Shuman, for having me here. This story that I will tell is about a visual identity program for a refugee camp done by my father in the early 1990s, and my attempt to reconstruct it 25 years later, along with other aspects of his design career. I should mention that parts of my presentation are done in the form of a visual essay and are narrated, so I hope you'll bear with me as I do the narration. The clicker is not going. All right. So, with the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s and during the war in Bosnia, my family left the besieged city of Sarajevo. We lived as refugees in Croatia, in Denmark, before ultimately settling in the United States. Sorry, this is skipping. Okay. We lived as refugees in Croatia and Denmark before ultimately settling in the United States. In Denmark, we lived in a refugee camp in these standard issue UNHCR field tents, which housed 3 Bosnian refugee families. And in the corner of our tent, my father made a tiny makeshift design studio, where he designed the visual identity program for our refugee camp. The pyramidal graphic forms in his logo denoted our tapering tent dwellings. He branded the camp Sahara in reference to the plot of sand on which our tents were erected. Sand is a camp-making surface. It kept our tents from pests, and it helped establish the camp's territory. Located in Nesbihovet-Broby, a village on the island Fyn in Denmark, the year was 1993. Metaphorically, the fluctuating nature of sand formations echoed the refugees' sense of baselessness. My father urged that refugees should be identified by name and not by a registration number assigned to them by the Danish Refugee Council. So for each tent, he created a sign that listed names of its residents. The sign featured an icon that referenced a trade, an occupation of one of the tent's residents. Our tent was marked by a pencil. He designed a welcome billboard for the entrance to the camp and posters announcing events at the camp, like this open house event where the refugees introduced themselves to the residents of this small village in Denmark. I reconstructed, I guess the poster already showed, I reconstructed the poster based on memory, or perhaps based on my imagination of what it could have been like. That's actually my mother rallying these kids to give a cheerful welcome to the visitors. The identity program also included a mock advertisement featuring a grass field with pyramids drawn in the background where a happy family walks and kills time. In anticipation of winter, tents were replaced by these prefabricated homes housing 10 families per building. My parents organized a school for the children living in Sahara by enlisting parents to teach elementary subjects. A doctor was assigned to teach biology, while an economist taught math. My father taught classes in the arts, and my mother was a teacher of chemistry. The local football club allowed us to use their facilities as classrooms. And soon, Sahara would become the camp's official designation in formal documents of the Danish Refugee Council, as well as the name of our self-organized school and football club. In 2002, my parents visited Denmark. At this point, we were living in the United States. They went to see the site where our refugee camp was once located and found a medical facility for disabled children in its place. The facility retained the name Sahara. Interestingly, I only recently discovered that the road closest to the camp is called Sandgrave Way. I'm not sure if this was always called that, or if it is a reference to Sahara's sand, or the reference to Sahara's sand was the motivation for the name. I like to think that Sahara had some lasting impact on the site, that refugees somehow colonized the site. This is what the site looks like today on Google Map. So 25 years later, I revisited my father's sketches, the few remaining photographs and video recordings from that time. It was part of my broader effort to use design as a reconstructive process, one that would allow me to retain aspects of memory that I fear would someday fade. My interest to revisit the story of Sahara was also prompted by seeing media images of refugees entering Europe and other parts of the world in recent years. Like Bosnians in the 1990s, refugees from Syria and Iraq, for example, are shown through wide-angle shots of streaming lines of people, indistinguishable masses at border crossings. Similar is true with images of refugees who are fleeing violence in Central American countries and coming into Mexico towards the US border. Their plight is given a different name, however, a caravan, and they usually aren't called refugees but migrants. So through design work in his improvised studio, my father attempted to signal hope and opportunity for our family and our fellow refugees. His initially playful gesture, a kind of an ironic gesture, further evolved into a collective action for improving conditions in the camp. It was an effort to be identified as more than refugees. And perhaps to shift the attention from the hard circumstances of war that brought them to Denmark towards some seeming normalcy, such as having a school or a football team. By assembling the story, I tried to present design as an agent that can enable vulnerable populations to assert a form to their own identifying image, make sense of extreme circumstances, contest subjection, and build community. I show this story to my students sometimes because I think it's a good lesson about the type of agency that design can have. When I shared a version of this visual essay with a person that did not know my personal history, he wasn't sure if this story is real or fictional. And that prompted me to continue Sahara's visual identity by reconstructing and expanding the original design to other applications. To imagine other things that could have been designed for Sahara, such as event posters like this one for the open house event. Or for example, I remember that our school received photocopied pages of Bosnian textbooks, which we then multiplied to use in our classes. So I started to reimagine the design of cover pages for those textbooks, and so that their design would reference an anecdote or a memory that I recall from that experience. So this would be a textbook for the 6th grade shop class, General Technical Education, designed in loving memory of Denmark, a bike-friendly place. The design of covers has to be lo-fi, right? It has to be photocopyable, using found imagery, typeset in ever-present Helvetica, of course, and easy to reproduce on a photocopier. This is the textbook for the 7th grade art class, literally translated as The Culture of Visual Form. In early 1994, Edvard Munch's painting, The Scream, was stolen from a museum in Norway. Around the same time, a group of people in Sahara, in our camp, proposed that we gather in front of a town square in Odense in Denmark and collectively scream in public to protest the marketplace massacre that took place in Sarajevo, where 68 people were killed around that time. this would be a textbook for the 8th grade physics class. The game of marbles is definitely an important aspect of my childhood memory. While growing up in Sarajevo, I was an avid player of marbles. When made wet, the sand surface in Sahara was perfect for this game, and children played it constantly. So, as I explained, the expanding Sahara's identity design serves as a way to recall various experiences from that period in Denmark. I've also attempted architectural reconstruction. I'm not an architect, with the help of Andrina Yepes, an architecture student assistant that I've been working with in Chicago. This is a plan of the camp based on my memory. There were 28 tents. I'm trying to recall as much as possible which family lived in which tent. There are containers of the offices for the Danish Refugee Council, cooking stations, showers, porta potties, playground, etc. The process goes back and forth between my description of the place, a mental image from my memory, and architectural plans. Here's a plan of our tent, identifying whose bed was where. What is interesting is that Andrina is a proper architecture student, so she sort of tries to provide proper access to beds and things like that, and then I'd have to sort of change it because, of course, people arrange their own tents in ways that were not properly architectural, perhaps. More recently, I've also attempted architectural reconstruction through digital rendering. The problem with digital renderings is that they can lack texture. They can appear lifeless, and the experience in Sahara was full of life. Actually, this is a screenshot of the image that appeared in Rhino, this 3D modeling application, and I kept it because it seemed most appropriate because of its kind of surreal color palette. It seemed to be a fitting kind of representation of that experience. A rendering of the entrance to the camp featuring the reconstructed Sahara sign. Anyways, I'm not sure exactly how I feel about the meaning of these renderings, other than to say that I'm interested in the process of going back and forth with the architect, the student, and adjusting my impression of the place. For a bit of context, my father studied graphic design at the Academy of Fine Art in Sarajevo. This is him in the center with his classmates in what was the first generation of graphic design students in Sarajevo. Much of his work at the time focused on images of pop rock culture icons. He was highly influenced by the experience he had at the famous Isle of Wight Music Festival in 1970 in the UK. It was the European version of Woodstock, and one of the last times that Jimi Hendrix performed before he died. I like this image of tents at the Isle of Wight because of the connection to our refugee camp tents many, many years later in a very different circumstance. This was one of the posters my father had done as part of his thesis project. It was an obituary for Mick Jagger. He predicted that after the deaths of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, that Mick Jagger would be next. And I suppose it's an example of a kind of unsuccessful speculative design project, since the Rolling Stone is very much alive. In the 1980s, he led an in-house creative studio at Svjetlost, one of Yugoslavia's large publishing companies. He took part in graphic design work for Sarajevo's 1984 Winter Olympic Games. This was his design for a certificate of appreciation to donors for the Olympics. This one specifically was awarded to my uncle, but really every household in the country received one of these certificates because in socialist Yugoslavia, everyone was a donor. 2% of every salary for the Olympics. Nobody dared to say no. These are pages from a catalog he designed for a large electrical engineering company in the late 80s. Here they were promoting the company's security system products, security systems for things like power plants. I guess the metaphor was that their security system were as strong as the ancient pyramids in Egypt. So maybe he was thinking that our tents were as strong as the pyramids in Egypt many years later. Unfortunately, my father managed to save only very few examples of his design work. So sort of growing up as an aspiring designer, I knew of his work, but there were very few examples that I saw, or that I had, I should say. Most of it was destroyed during the war in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So I've been reconstructing some of his work based on his descriptions and based on my memories of it from childhood. He won 2 logo design competitions for the Congress of the League of Communists of Bosnia, a rather large political convention during those times. I knew the story, but I had never seen the logos until I reconstructed them. He won the contest for the 8th and 9th Congress. The theme for the 8th Congress was progress. He said that the mark he designed connoted a clenched fist, but I actually think that the gaps between the alternating lines stemming from the bold red star symbolized the party's gradual acceptance of new ideas. He said that the 9th Congress was meant to be the Congress of reform, of turnaround, of the Communist Party becoming more open, hence the number 9 that suggests a turn in direction. Instead of reform, however, soon thereafter, the country was swept up by nationalist movements and ravaged by war. So I think this was probably the last Congress. I reconstructed this mark for the mining company in the town of Zenica. Instead of 2 intersecting hammers seen on every other logo for a mining company, this one had a kind of a constructivist motif in the form of a L. Lissitzky. So reconstruction comes out of my desire to rebuild a collection of my father's work that was lost, but also from an effort to use design as a way to recall or make sense of historical context or even family narratives. There's maybe something curious in reconstructing someone else's design career. It brings up interesting questions related to history, memory, and interpretation. And finally, this is Sahara in 2018. Last summer, for the first time after 25 years, I had a chance to visit the site where the camp was located. Parts of the site are a grass field with a pedestrian walkway going through it, no signs of Sahara or the refugees anymore. So my idea was to leave some signs, at least temporary ones, that will signal to the fact that some still remember this place. The other part of the area where the camp was located is now a residential neighborhood whose houses resemble an American suburb, with garages and driveways and basketball hoops. So I left some signs there as well. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Let's move on to Natasha's presentation. Then we'll have a conversation together and perhaps open it up for some Q&A. Nataša Petrešin-Bachelez is an independent curator, writer, and editor. She has curated projects and exhibitions for the Times Museum, Gwangju, Sursut Museum, Beirut, Jeux de Paume, and Centre Pompidou in Paris. She was the chief editor of the publishing platform L'International online and is currently curator of the Contour Biennale 9, titled Coltan as Cotton. Welcome, Nataša.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hope you're all fine. And thank you for inviting me here first to the organizers, Schumann, Fawz, and Victoria, and to Fatima and Judel for wonderful welcoming as well. Thank you, Amir. I'm coming from Ljubljana originally, so we share the same space and time, former Yugoslavia, so I'm every time very much moved, actually to tears, when I see things like that, that remind us of where we are coming from. And I believe that as a part of that experience, although Slovenia is a small country in the north that was always somehow reflected upon as a kind of this separatist, too much working people who wanted first to break free from the Yugoslavian grasp, etc. I mean, my father's family is from Bosnia, so there is a lot of alliances and a lot of feelings. And I guess that it's something that relates very much to the ways I try to work as a curator, and independent curator, which means very much dependent curator, those who are here as cultural workers and precarious independent workers know very well what this means. So I very much, ever since I have started working, I was very closely working with several artists coming from Slovenia, such as Marko Pelhan, who Umeda and Gediminas know very well as well, who have been bringing together issues of ecological themes that are intrinsically linked with sociological and social issues. So issues of environmental justice, social justice is something that is intrinsically linked, And whenever I try to work in the sphere of contemporary art, on these questions, I try to bring these entanglements together. And so to go directly to, so I don't live in Ljubljana anymore, in my hometown in Slovenia. I live now in Paris since last 14 years. I have been working on several projects developing this kind of ideas. Most recently was one in Beirut with Nora Razian. We created a show together about questions around climate change and colonialism. And based on that came the invitation actually to the Contour Biennial, which is located in Mechelen, a city which is 30-minute drive away by train from Brussels in Belgium, and which was used to be a moving image biennial. And when the invitation came, and the more I have been working on these issues of sustainability, trying to think about what kind of content the artists are producing, the more I had the need to actually address the ways we are working. So we heard something of that from our first presentation today of the Swamp Pavilion, but actually really thinking about what is the materiality of our work, of our working practices, of our methods, of research, of work as artists, as curators, is something that is very important to me, as well as it's as important as understanding the invitation as a way or a means where questions of how to situate that kind of questions is actually of extreme importance for me as well. So why this title? And so these are the lyrics from Saul Williams, that is a slam poet who has been working a lot on the questions of the African continent and extractivism in his poetry. And it's actually his poem called Colton is Cotton. And when I came to Mechelen, sorry, I wanted to just stay a little bit with that, but when I came to Mechelen, I realized that, so first of all, I'm in Belgium. I'm not living there, but I know some of its dark colonial past, but also I tried to understand where Mechelen is located, and it turned out to be a place where in Europe the first continental railway was built. After UK, between Mechelen and Brussels in 1835, there is a train that is built. And later on in the 20th century, Mechelen becomes a gruesome place where between 1942 and 1944 there is a concentration camp. Actually, it's a regroupment camp, sorry. One of the two regroupment camps of Nazi Germany that was outside of Germany and that brought 25,000 Jews and Roma to Auschwitz. 1% of them survived. And when you go into that story, the reason that they put it in Mechelen is, so it's between Antwerp and Brussels, lies Mechelen. It was because of the railway. So the railway was well established, was leading towards Germany, and because of that, they thought logistically, of course. So we think of that in the light of colonial endeavors, how the routes were made, how the transport of human labor, transport of goods has always first laid the roots and sort of led to the technological, social, human progress. But actually it, in most of cases, leads to, well, genocide. So for me it was a kind of, let's say, like a legitimate way of why and how I could address the question of the need to think about degrowth and how it's related to decolonial thinking by bringing it to that city as a kind of topic. So the coltan that appears in the title is, who knows about the coltan? Who has heard about coltan? Great, thank you. So we all have it in our phones and in our computers. It's an absolutely necessary element that keeps the possibility of having us connected. And this is actually the way we work, right? So we cannot work today without being internet. It's almost impossible. And coltan in 60%, 65% globally is mined in Congo. Congo is Belgium's former colony. And it was for me, in a way, a possibility to say coltan as cotton. Very much, so it, as you can see it here, it's actually, it's mined with nails. There is a lot of children labor, it's uncontrolled, it's a so-called conflict mineral. There are many, many violent conflicts and deaths revolving around the benefit of it. And we are all, in a way, entangled in that violence by using the phones and laptops that we are using. So, in a way, it kind of brings this wish to actually give forth or just work around, or like Donna Haraway would say, stay with the trouble, to, in a way, remind ourselves that there is a real materiality behind our immaterial labor. I mean, immaterial in the sense that it's like flowing somewhere in the air, it's invisible to our eyes. However, it's very, very material. And if we think about, we had this conversation also in the morning, but what can then we do with it? When you think that actually there is a, how do you say, like a projection of the carbon footprint in 20 years from now, they are saying that actually the carbon footprint of us working online will reach the carbon footprint of US, for example. So what does this mean also? Because it's the servers that run, so like how much of carbon footprint do we do just by clicking and ordering some food, for example. So this kind of wanted, yeah, I proposed this to the board. Was funnily enough, I was selected. But it was also a question how to then situate this biennial in the way that would go in a different direction that most of the biennials are going, which is intrinsically linked to cultural tourism. And a kind of industry that the cities actually and economies are again aligned and intersectionally and just linked one to another. So we are not working on an exhibition. It's a 1-year open space and time where contributors, artists, activists, organizations are working very much on these questions, but trying to find actually partners in the city, so people that work in that way already. So in that sense also thinking like, okay, we are not, this is not an we are not inventing anything, this is existing. People are trying to find answers to those questions. And we have 3 public moments in this 1 year that I also decided to align with different moon phases, because moon, as we know, it's it was our ancient calendar, and it was a female calendar, 28 days. So it's also like to think in an ecofeminist way how the old rhythms actually have always defined us and keep on defining us even if we are just like this all the time. So an important part of the biennial for me was to think, is to think, so 2 more public moments are to come. There is also a decision to work very much, for example, we try to bring up to 80% of contributors are coming by train, which means that I actually very consciously work with artists and contributors living in and around Belgium and with institutions that are located there. This is on very much kind of like a logistical level. But I also am questioning and putting questions into the hosting institution, actually, which is a theater place that has now is now running the biennial, which works in a very so Mechelen is a very multicultural place, but my team and me included, I mean, we can call each other like the Brown of the Europe. I mean, the Eastern Europe, and the racisms related to that part are very known. But my team is a white Flemish team. So I also am actually very proactively asking them to try to reflect and self-reflect, actually be very self-reflexive about the ways they are working. And so not only to understand a biennial as something that comes and goes, and then a next curator will come, etc., but what can actually really remain in place. So this all brings me to the alliance that we designed within as a very important part of this, I would call it a research, because it's as much as research for me as it's for everybody who is involved, it brings us to the school. It brings us to the fact that if we are to think about near future, where the resources, whatever resources we are talking about, either material, intellectual, stable, unstable, resilient resources, they have to start with the education. They have to start very early. I mean, I even believe that actually the faculties, it's too late. It should start from as soon as a child is being socialized or institutionalized in that way. And so, but we started with Adrian Lahoud from Royal School of Architecture in London, and Bram Kravitz, who is sadly no longer with us, who was behind he founded the Open Design course for asylum seekers and refugees in Ghent, in Belgium. So I kind of came with them with this idea that why don't we try to create an alliance of courses across Belgium with one universities in France, one satellite is there in Hong Kong by Merve Bedir, but she was before in Holland, that's why she's kind of remained there. And Adrian, whose students are in London, to give actually students a very simple question. What would be, could we think about transforming our practices as architects, students of design, art students, intercultural communication students? Could we think about the ways that transform our methods of working that would become inclusive, socially responsible, sustainable, ecological, anti-racist? And how do these practices then actually influence the ways these artists, architects and designers will work in the near future? What will they actually think, also like from the scratch, from the material side to ethical and social side about their practices? So that's why it's called We Cannot Work Like This. It comes from Nataša Sadar-Hakigian, an artist living in Berlin, from her work from 2007, which is a kind of, there are nails very angrily put in the wall that say, when you go out of the focus, you see that it says, I can't work like this. And it's we are trying to work on this entanglement between the decolonial practices, so very much situating it in, again, in Belgium, and its relations to Congo and Rwanda, and the necessity of thinking about degrowth. We have the ways we are working. So we launched, so this is the event that took place in Ghent. These are the students of the Open Design course in Ghent who were trying to voice together kind of a poem. It's a sound piece. They did a sound piece. Each one was singing in their own language. We came together 3 times. So this is from the invitation that we got from Nomeda and Gediminas to to come to the Swamp Pavilion and stay there for 2 days, 3 days. We are coming 3 times together with the students where they have a possibility actually to work with one another across disciplines, obviously. So I think that is also something that we touched this morning with Grant Watson, thinking about what actually the art schools of the tomorrow can be and how interdisciplinary they should be. Not in the sense of applied financial, economical, applied thinking, but really thinking about creativity as that kind of force and that kind of potential that can bring us actually further in this kind of thinking. So the students are reading together different literature, some proposed by the teachers, but we also obviously try to go beyond that and very much try to work on relationships, who is teaching whom. Debating, so this is in Venice, that was like an afternoon session based on literature that was, so it was in the Sierra dei Giardini. And that was in the Swamp Pavilion, where we were trying to also, so we use, for example, the way they stay in touch with one another and to be updated about how and where their research are. It's all obviously based on open source tools, because this is still, I believe, a technology that, looking into the history of internet, where it was and where we are today, and how it has been colonized by different forces, political and economical forces. It's really far away from what internet was promising to be, and I think the open source obviously remains the space of resistance to that. And then the second time we met in London at the Royal College of Architecture, where we brought together 2 important campaign works. One started from very much from the student alignments, working and understanding institutions as places where the real intersectional methodology should be actually put in place. Intersectional meaning, in the Kimberly Crenshaw's term, where it is an entanglement between race, class, religion, gender. It's a kind of vision and a method of looking at any kind of event, literally, where these factors and these worldviews, if you want, are actually every time brought together to understand a certain situation. In that sense, for example, the students from Goldsmith and in other schools aligned themselves with the cleaners in their institutions, or with the security workers. I often ask that question when I work in the institutions, art institutions. I often ask the question if they know their cleaners by name, or if they know their names, or if they know their lives, or if they know where they're coming from and how much they are paid. And so, for example, the Goldsmith students, together with the cleaners, produced certain banners. So one which is beautiful is "Who Keeps the Cube White?" And it appeared at the opening of the new space at the Goldsmith College just recently. And so we invited them to speak together with several women who run the campaign called Justice for Grenfell. It's the tower that was burned down, very tragically, killing a lot of people in Grenfell, in the center of London. And these women are trying to work on bringing accountability to that case, in the sense that there is always somebody who is, like in war situation, it was not him, it was me, it was them, it was not me, obviously, in that kind of way. So they are trying to really work, they're working with, in a very interdisciplinary way, where they're also bringing architects to responsibility about what happened with the tower. So it was very important for the students to actually hear in up to which degree you can feel actually co-responsible for that kind of a disaster. And I think I have a few more. So this was, our meeting was, so thinking about this with the students together, we are actually developing an idea to form together a charter. You know, there exist charters in institutions that are charters for, you know, recycling, putting down the light, recycling material, etc. But could there be a charter or just a kind of like a manual, let's say, more than a charter, that would bring together thinking about ethics and ecology at the same time? So this is what they have had as a task, and one of the groups presented, for example, so it was, we projected it into 100 years from now, and one of the groups came with a beautiful narrative, which was so all written in different languages of the group itself. So you can see it here on the below, and the narrative that ran was that it's an island made out of plastic. So you know the kind of sixth continent, the plastic island in the ocean, floating there, bringing together all the plastic that is thrown into the sea. And on it lives a community of people who is known as the first community who has been successfully decolonized. And this is all what they gave as a kind of pitch, and it was on us to decipher what does it mean successfully decolonized, and what does it mean to survive on that island. And what was very interesting is that everybody, after a discussion of 20 minutes, wanted to find a way to come to that island, which was an island made of plastic, which will be an island made of plastic. So it was very interesting, like as soon as you close the door, everybody is trying to get in a certain way. And this is another group of students who are proposing to break the canon, make the canon. It's a group of students in Antwerp who have put this in their library and ask very actively, obviously, to very actively intervene in the politics of buying the books for the library, which is also usually very much top-down endeavor. So they are also asking this kind of question, and I love the way so they designed this Ouroboros. You know, it's this medieval old symbol of snake biting its own tail. So again, it's the circularity. Again, we are back to the moon phases, and again about it's all about the kind of cycles that we are in, and. It's also very much about the food, about how do we produce our food. In London, again, we were greeted by the Brixton Pond, that is an institution that cooks food out of waste. So they gather from local shops around all the food that is put aside as a waste. So from carrots that don't look good to to different pieces of meat and they cook with it, and they offer this as a kind of social project. So we were cooking together a meal there. So because also obviously as a part of the degrowth practice, it's something that the food comes in as a kind of sustainable force, and with the ingredients that too often travel from all over the world on our plate. So this is again very much interesting to observe that not only art students but also architecture students and design students are constantly, in every presentation we have, the food comes again back. And so this very much in a way influenced us and inspired us, this place in Brixton. This was our final gathering in London, and where we try to brainstorm about certain themes, putting the language into action also is something that is important when we think about education, when we think about transmission, especially when we try to see if we can go around by not naming the same concepts that exist, and then try to, as some students say, try to decolonize the language and decolonize the terms that are brought in specific curriculums, in specific courses. That's why the freedom is there, but it's especially a lot of care needs to be also invoked in doing that. And so we are gathering for the last time in this space, which is very it's a lucky coincidence. In May, there is the full moon phase happening, so it's the second phase of the biennial where the students are coming together for the last time. They have been together for a whole year working. And the Thomas More School in Mechelen, which is it's a school of different, they have design department, they have intercultural communication, journalism, and their main space for students to work is actually in a former gym. So I thought where we thought really together, I think there is not a better place to inhabit for an alliance called We Cannot Work Like This. Then in a gym space, transformed, but still having this kind of tools that can be used for training the body and the mind, and the spirit and the soul and each other. So we are meeting there for 2 days in May, alongside with the program of the Biennale, and. Let's see if this charter actually comes to life. But so this is what I wanted to talk about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nataša. That was excellent. I have some questions for you both, but I'll just ask you, Nataša, since you just presented. It's the work of the curators. Really quite educational. The curator from project to project is constantly having to learn, with each new project and with each new collaboration, and then transmit what is being learned to, the environment, the audience, and so on. And it's interesting that you're also kind of teaching the biennial and trying to take that position of yours as, not just cultural tourism, but to kind of really expand that and to take that throughout, the show's duration and thinking of it as a research project. So I'm interested. There's a couple of questions, and then you can kind of respond to it. The question of transforming our practices. When it comes down to working with these students and with these different educators in different locations. You kind of showed us a little bit of how that looked like in those moments. But I'm curious to. How does that continue looking like? And then in relation to the students' work and their educators' work, but also you mentioned the D word, decolonizing and decolonization and thinking in a decolonized way. And I'm really curious, it's a term that is being used constantly, and I'd love for you to explain how it's being dealt with and what kind of conversations these students are having, the age group as well. And then just kind of lastly, the logistics of that, because you mentioned we went then here and then we ended up here. So also, is there a continuity with the students going from place to place, or is it a new group of students speaking to new people each time. So yeah, perhaps you could just explain a little bit more.
Thank you very much. So I'll start with the last question. The students are, actually it's very organically how they start to build alliances, but it still goes very much through the fact that, for example, for London, since we're working with this the open design course for refugees and asylum seekers, they don't have documents. A lot of them don't. So, for example, they couldn't come to Venice. And it was a really a very critical moment for the Alliance. They were, the students were extremely critical of us actually going to Venice. Why did we have to go there? It's an age-old dinosaur biennial, nation-state built biennial, whereas we could have met in Belgium, where most of students are there. And also, it really, in a way, especially those who were those students that could not travel and stayed in Belgium, for their colleagues, their direct peers, it was a really. Of course, it was not the first time that they would experience something like that, but it was a defining factor. So when the second meeting happened in London. The whole group of students from Antwerp decided to stay in Brussels and organize, because again, some people couldn't travel, and so they organized a parallel event in Brussels, where they also spent the same amount of time together as we did in London. We were in touch, updating each other what we are doing, but that was, in a way, their response. No, we are not coming, we're staying here, and those that can't travel are staying within Belgium. So I thought that was a really something that I experience rarely, because usually, you know, it's quite the opposite. We love to travel, but here thinking about, well, actually, what does it mean? What is the privilege of traveling? What kind of documents do I have? And what kind of documents do you have? Where are you from, etc. So all these questions really, in a way, I feel and I see how it starts to mold them. Secondly, so it's something that, is everything fine? Is it a? It's a divine intervention.
So I think it's a performance. Someone's intervention into what you're saying right now.
And okay.
Not a fire.
Well,
Better if we just evacuated.
yeah, exactly. I thought, like, okay, maybe we should have a walk and find a swamp and feel unsecure and unstable. But so that kind of things are happening very organically. And about the D word, I do agree. It's again becoming that kind of decolonize the language, decolonize the decolonial term. Actually, some people would put it like, let's not use it any longer. But when I started to work on the biennial in Belgium, I realized that after one group visit of students of 16 years old, when they were asked if they know about the colonial history of Belgium and which colonies there were, like, for example, if they could name some of the colonies, they could name some, but they didn't learn this from school. And we are in 2019, and they are 16 years old, and I think this is impossible. That's really, like, it was beyond belief. So in that sense, I do insist on bringing that back in, and I also have to say it is absolutely not the only event in Belgium that is working on those practices. There are really a handful of activist spaces, mostly of people who are Afro-descendant, so coming either from the former colonies or other countries in the continent, living in Belgium. and are working on that specific issues, and I'm very inspired by them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I have a question for you, Amir. And I just to add to what you presented to us, can you tell us about how, preservation, memory, and reconstruction has been productive as a lesson to you and your students, and how your students have actually, used this lesson? Because I suppose I'm curious about what it means as an educator to also reconstruct someone else's career within the space, within your work. So, but then there's also follow-up, and I know I'm asking many questions in one, but that's because I would like to also open it up to the audience before we run out of time. Just also, if you could touch upon sorry, I have this written here. Can't read my handwriting. Using these imagined textbooks that you've kind of created, kind of what might that lead to as well?
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to answer that. I mean, I guess the first thing to admit is that there's a very personal motivation for doing this, right? Because it's part of my personal and family history. So there's a kind of a personal motivation not to forget the story. So if I were a filmmaker, maybe I'd make a movie about it. If I were a writer, maybe I would write it. But as a designer, sort of that's my way of kind of processing that and making sense of that experience, right? There's a lesson about design that comes from my father. So to me, as a designer, and especially when I was a younger designer, that was certainly a lesson of sort of what it means to always act as a designer in every circumstance, whether that's a professional circumstance or a kind of extreme circumstance like the one that I described. So I show this work to my students because I also want them to sort of understand or have an expansive view of the way that one can imagine design practice, right? Not only one that is sort of concerned with the obvious kind of problem-solving, aspect of design practice, which is certainly legitimate, but also one that is discursive. So I think that sort of answers hopefully your first question. Now, when it comes to how I deal with the reconstruction and what does, reconstructing posters that may or may not have existed or textbook covers that may or may not have existed in the way that I reconstruct them, I think that's sort of a question of memory and history or memory and documentation, right? So I'm kind of interested in this kind of speculative practice, but in this case, it's a speculative practice that goes in reverse, so it goes backwards and not forwards. So I'm kind of like interested in that territory between, not necessarily fiction, but let's say, for lack of a better word, between sort of documentation and fiction. So I try to use narratives or anecdotes or memories which are real, or they are real for me. I try to use them as kind of prompts to design something. So the document, the truth is there, it's just not exact in the way that a real historian would deal with it.